This week's episode of Dominaria's Judgment is brought to you by StarCityGames.com at the StarCityGames.com weekly sale. And this week, the ever-popular Bonus Bucks is back. Get 10% back in Bonus Bucks site-wide on all orders placed from Monday, December 20th at 11 a.m. through Sunday, December 26th at 11:59 p.m. That's everything site-wide. Magic cards, sealed products, sleeves, even non-magic items like Flesh and Blood. Normally, I would direct you to StarCityGames.com/sale for the details of what's on sale, but that's everything except the usual pre-order exception. But if you missed this week's Bonus Bucks and you're listening to this episode a little late, you can check out StarCityGames.com/sale, that's SALE, to see what's our latest great deal on Magic the Gathering singles, sealed product, or supplies.
What's up, gamers? Ryan Overturf here to remind you to check out the 540, Star City Games' very own Cube podcast, where every week myself and Justin Parnell will be tackling topics regarding all things Cube Draft. We're talking set reviews, digital Cube retrospectives, archetype breakdowns, tons of tips on both how to design your own cube as well as play other people's cubes, with plenty of nonsense interspersed. If you're into Cube Draft, we would love it if you gave us a listen, and if you're not, maybe we can fix that. Check out the 540 every week right here on StarCityGames.com and wherever you find your podcasts.
This week's episode of Dominaria's Judgment is also brought to you by Coalesce Apparel, your first stop for Magic the Gathering inspired stylings. Visit coalesceapparel.shop to pick up a t-shirt inspired by fan-favorite Magic personalities, a hoodie from your favorite guild in the Ravnica University line, or just signal your intent to snap Keep in the Dark with an anti-Mulligan Mulligan Club sticker. Want a splash of a commander deck? Check out the Keep in 100 sticker line and see if your favorite commander shows up there. Whatever you order, use code SCG at checkout to save 10% on your purchase at coalesceapparel.shop. Coalesce Apparel. Nobody made what they wanted, so they made it themselves.
Hello everyone and welcome to episode 37 of Dominaria's Judgment, a weekly modern podcast brought to you by StarCityGames.com. I'm Dom Harvey, I'm here with Ari Lax, and our previous episode on the ban list didn't get as much backlash or as much praise, honestly, as I was hoping for. We got very little feedback in either direction, which from a content creation standpoint is the worst place you can be. Any publicity is good publicity. So maybe our second foray into that here will rile some more people up and generate some more discussion or discourse even.
Yeah, I think we're legally obligated to make bad takes in order to get clicks. I think that is literally how the internet works these days.
Yeah, there is a one topic as it pertains to the ban list, which is guaranteed to generate a lot of clicks and discussion and so on and so forth, all of that good stuff. But I don't know if we'll get to that in this episode. Maybe we'll save it for its own segment when we need to push the emergency brake and really get people going over the holiday season.
Yeah, maybe next time we'll get around to a 4-mana enchantment of some kind. But for now, there's plenty of other cards to discuss.
Yeah, and we'll get to all of those after going over the results from the weekend, as always. And there's a lot to get to this week, a lot of stuff going on here. And I think the place to start is with the Showcase playoff that happened on Magic Online over the weekend. So you may remember that when we discussed the Showcase Qualifier or Showcase Challenger, unclear exactly what the naming conventions are for these, that fed into this one. The winner there was Bob49, noted modern combo specialist playing Belcher, and the winner of this playoff event, going to the marks, going to the Pro Tour equivalent now as well, is Bob49 playing Belcher.
Yeah, I think that this was a very specifically good call for a small field where I think that there was this sort of pressure to next level the idea that people would be showing up with Ragavan decks. I think that like the level 0 assumption is that a lot of the nonsense is cut out of the field, so there's going to be a lot of Ragavan and Hammer. The level 2 assumption from that is that you should like play the decks that beat those, which is basically good control decks. And then Bob49 showing up with Belcher, a player that has won events with Belcher before, like that is the deck that beats the decks that beat the decks that people are going to play, something like that.
Yeah, it's a good level N+1 choice, however high we're going there. But it is also just a fundamentally powerful linear strategy. And that's a good failsafe to have in Modern, where I think on the opposite side of the spectrum, you have these 4-color good stuff pile decks where they, in theory, have the tools to be anything and you are hedged in all of these different spots. But ultimately, if something shows up which is really pushing you hard on one particular axis, then you need to have those specific cards in a certain time frame in your 80 card deck, and that doesn't always come together very well. Whereas with Belcher, even in these hypothetically poor matchups, sometimes you just go off on turn 3, or you have a turn 2 Blood Moon, or you have the tools to just steal games out from nowhere. And that's always been, from Modern's inception here, and we'll get into Modern's inception in a little bit, that has always been one of the best quality the deck can have.
Yeah, Bob49 had posted their deck on Twitter, so I just wanted to highlight some stuff. This is the player that had previously been 0 main deck Blood Moons, is now up to a single copy. I really like that for the deck. Double Reforge for redundancy in the combo kill with like the main deck Pyromancer Ascension backup. And I think the only thing that I want to note otherwise is that Magus of the Moon is in the sideboard instead of actual Blood Moon. I don't have like a big opinion on which way is better there, but just a notable thing to point out.
Yeah, that's always been an interesting choice for the decks that could, in theory, play either one of those. And sometimes the idea has been to play both, right? So these Ponza decks in the past have had somewhere between 6 to 8 copies combined with the 2 of those effects normally. And it's been a good way to, if your deck is one which your opponents already want to be bringing in enchantment removal against, to pivot to Makers of the Moon as opposed to Blood Moon, or if you're a deck which is vulnerable to creature removal, if Lightning Bolt is a good card against your deck, then Blood Moon itself is going to be the better choice over Magus most of the time. So the example that I think of there is Omar Belden, who we mentioned as top 8ing the event that qualified for this with the Stirrings Veil build of Hammer. Back in the Twin versus Summerbloom days, he and some other Canadian players had a Twin list that had Makers of the Moon over Blood Moon, because the main matchup you were boarding that effect in was against Amulet Bloom, and that deck already had a bunch of Swan Songs and Seal of Primordiums against you, and so Blood Moon actually was a much more vulnerable card than Magus in the matchup, despite, most of the time, out of context, a 2/2 creature is far easier to remove than an enchantment. Sometimes in the matchups where the moon effects are at a premium, that's not always the case.
Yeah, I know this has come up a few other times, also revolving around... I'm trying to remember the exact situations involving it. I think maybe it was like weirdly out of the sideboard of... I want to say this might be crazy, but it may have been like some sort of Valakut deck involving trying to beat like Amulet Titan and Tron, but that might just be some crazy stuff I'm misremembering.
I vaguely remember that too. Yeah.
Okay.
You do sometimes see the Mega show up where just being a creature is a relevant property by itself. So for example, we have some of the Yogmoth decks having the lightest possible touch of red for one card in the 75, and that is a singular copy of Makers of the Moon, because against Amulet or Tron or some of these other big mana decks or 4-color decks with these non-basic heavy mana bases, well, now your Eldritch Evolution and your Call of Calling can sometimes just win you the game on the spot with no other setup, just by finding that one copy there. But for the decks that do have a choice, that is an interesting one to pass out sometimes. I will also note, though, that in Belcher, one of the incentives to play this deck is that your opponents will often have so many dead cards against you that they are forced to leave in some of them. And so you may end up getting into this like level N-1 situation where your Magus dies to the Unholy Heats or the Lightning Bolts, which are otherwise terrible in the matchup, but your opponent had to keep in something. And so that's likely to be creature removal or something else which has basically no application against the main deck.
Yeah. So I did notice that Bob49 had posted to Twitter a YouTube link with the replays of, I think, the entire qualifier. So check out Bob449449 on Twitter to find that and take a look. It's probably pretty interesting because the weird games with Belcher can get real weird. Anything else you want to point out from this top 8? Because it looks like fairly stock beyond that. Just, some Blink decks, some Luris decks, Shadow Saga, Grixis pile, a Prowess deck sneaking in there.
I would just echo that recommendation to go and check out those VODs. I have not had the time to dive deep into those myself yet, but this is another example of a player who has posted consistently strong finishes with a deck which is quite unusual conceptually, but also the talk of the town right now, putting out the best quality content on it that you're going to find essentially for free, just out in the public. So definitely go and examine that. And I think the dynamic here with these small exclusive events is quite interesting as it pertains to Modern. So there's a lot of metagaming for the expected field here, and Belcher fits into that dynamic quite nicely. But also, now that Bob has qualified for the Marks coming up in February, that dynamic takes on a whole new form, where assuming Modern is the constructed format that will be played there, you now have one person in your 8-player pod, so to speak, who you know is very likely to be on, if not Belcher, then some other combo deck. And that really throws other people for a loop, where, you know, the expected payoff of your 4-color deck, for example, that gets a lot worse if you know, there's a locked-in Belcher pilot in that field. And so one player who will have to navigate that dynamic, is Canister, who, in a glorious twist of fate, spiked the legacy qualifier for the equivalent tournament this weekend, and then spiked that too to qualify for the Marks. And so this is someone who hates legacy so much that any talk of the format is officially banned in his Discord, and that is the route that he took to qualify for the most exclusive tournament on Magic Online. And so Canister, as a Modern specialist, has been innovating on this 4-color deck for a while, was one of the first people to bring it into the spotlight. But I don't know if we can see him show up with that deck, knowing that, this is his likely opposition here.
Yeah, it is an 8-player event, so you can kind of just hope that they lose on the other side of the bracket, but it is a risk. Maybe you just show up, I was gonna say maybe you show up with the Meddling Mage list, but literally the YouTube like snip that shows up from Bob's Twitter is him defeating a Meddling Mage, I believe.
Yeah, so I can't just rely on any one card to get the job done there. And I think this general discussion of smaller metagames really is thrown into sharp relief when you look at the prelims that happen a lot. And we focus mainly on the challenge results here, and when we get to nonsense of the week, usually we're diving into leagues for that. But the prelims occupy this interesting space in between, where they are probably the toughest pound-for-pound competition that you find on Magic Online outside of these small exclusive events. And that's largely because you don't get that many players for them, and the Modern ones are actually the one exception there, where they do get 20, 30 people reliably. But whenever you sign up for a prelim, you recognize at least half of the names in there if you've played a prelim before. And so you have this quite small metagame full of experienced players, where a lot of them are strongly associated with one or two archetypes in particular. And the 4-color deck has been crushing these prelims consistently, more so there than really anywhere else. And so that's I don't know quite how you interpret that result, but it's an interesting thing to file away at least.
Yeah, I don't really have a good picture on where that falls in the whole like metagame slide between each of these, because there's another thing I think we'll talk about in a bit related to the showcase playoff and the challenges, which is that the burn performance in this playoff was like actually horrendous. Someone collected the data and all the results, and like the burn players are just like all in the bottom half. Literally, I think the most prolific burn player in the event, oddly uneven, literally just the 0-3 drop. And then the challenges this weekend, burn put up acceptable results. So I think that may be another thing that kind of gets skewed by the small field there. So something to kind of keep in mind depending on what events you're playing next. If you're traditionally a burn player, maybe stay away from it if you're playing like a smaller field event where the metagame is going to condense more around, I guess specifically probably like the 4-color deck and similar things. Whereas if you're playing in a larger field, like Burn's a totally fine choice.
Yeah, and Burn is a deck which you can attack if you want to, and in very obvious ways. And so by choosing Burn, you are effectively making a statement about whether you think other players will want to do that. And if you are a known Burn player in a small tournament, then the incentives are pretty strong there to actually prepare for you. Worth noting as well that these are not the inexperienced Burn players that you might run into at your LGS or in a league where they are leaving points of damage on the table here. These are people who often qualified for the tournament by playing Burn. And so they've proven their chops with that deck and will be playing it at a close to optimal capacity, and yet are still not having success with that dynamic in mind. Also, Merfolk went 0-3 in this tournament, so you hate to see that, but just fighting that one away for the record too here.
Well, maybe if it had made top 8, it could have beat all the 4-color decks.
Yeah, maybe. Anyway, moving on here, let's jump ahead to the PTQ that happened over the weekend here to see who will be joining Bob49 in that tournament. And some interesting results here. Crouching Footfalls making a glorious return to the Modern format.
Yeah, I noticed that there was basically zero true Azorius in this event, and I think that that is like the very clean opening for Crashing Footfalls to come back. Like that is the scariest matchup that you'd have to play against, and everything else is like the stuff you would play against already anyways. So makes sense. This list looks literally like it's copy pasted from a few months ago. I think the only difference is a larger number of gemstone caverns than usual. Really nothing. I mean, there are only so many cards the deck can play, so it tends to look about the same every time, but it really does look the same.
It did seem to me a week or two ago that the format looked ripe for a return of the Cascade decks as a broad category. And that has manifested to some extent, but it's been basically all Footfalls and no Living End, even though I thought Living End was maybe the more powerful deck in the abstract and seemed better positioned just given where the format was going. And that dynamic, if you expect Footfalls to make a return, then that's another point in favor of Living End, which I think is pretty far ahead in the head-to-head there.
Yeah, I think some of that may have to do with the higher interaction deck being slightly better call against Hammer, which is one of the more prominent decks across, not the small field result, but all these large tournament results. There is a lot of Hammer. I think maybe that's it, but I'm not entirely sure there.
Yeah, and Hammer has really stood the test of time in a way that I find quite impressive, where if you look at what the rest of the format is up to at the moment, so the 4-color decks tend to line up fairly well against Hammer. The Grixis Shadow decks, I think, are the best iteration of the DRC Ragavan shell that we've seen against Hammer in particular. And then also the rest of the format has quite heavily adapted to Hammer's presence in it. And it's honestly quite hard to find what the good matchups are for Hammer now that you're actively excited to play against. And yet, despite all of that, the deck just keeps on winning because fundamentally it is maybe the best thing you can be doing in the format.
Yep, that sounds all about right to me. I think it's notable that, like, even with the, Dragon's Rage Channeler and Shadow and Dress Down and all this stuff popping back up, there's just like, the respect is like, I'll play a Sanctifier on back. It's not even like playing a bunch of them. It's just like, yeah, we got one of those. We'll draw it sometimes. We'll just, win the matchup the rest of the time. It's fine. So yeah, that was like a really interesting thing skimming through lists as I started to like notice like, wait, where's this card in their sideboard? They're not playing it because they just don't care, I guess.
Speaking of which, moving on to second place here, we have Falcon with Orzhov Hammer with the one Sanctifier on deck in the sideboard and a more interactive main deck. We've got 3 Portable Hole here, and instead of the backup 0-drop, so whichever of Memnite and Ornithopter you think is worse, this list has the Mishra's Baubles to, a better card to draw in the abstract, pairs well with your Ingenious Smith, and then also pairs well with Lurrus in these kind of longer, grandier games. And Falcon had an interesting weekend here, getting second in this tournament, but luckily it's a super qualifier, so the top 2 qualify. So they punched their ticket to the set championship. And then I think looking at the schedule while this was happening, like as they were getting ready for top 8, also hopped in the Pioneer Challenge and made it to second place there. So a pretty good weekend, coming up just short in both tournaments. But, I think they'll take it given the outcome here.
Yeah, that's really impressive. I was not taking a look at the Pioneer results, so I missed that. That is quite impressive.
Yeah, a Pioneer format, which obviously we don't cover in any detail on this podcast, but one which I continually think deserves more attention because whenever I play it or whenever I watch it, it just seems like the healthiest format going on in Magic at the moment by a lot of metrics.
Yeah, I'm a big fan of what's going on. I just wish I had more excuses to play more of it. That's really just where I'm at.
That's the thing. You have to be a fairly enfranchised Magic Online player who also isn't really focused on the kind of organized play that goes on Magic Online. And that's a fairly small niche, sad to say. Anything else that stands out to you from this PTQ result?
Not really. I think a lot of this stuff from this weekend is like pretty stock at this point. I think the only thing from this PTQ is like the green version of Hammer shows up again in the top 8. I'm writing my article next week about like all the small variations of Hammer. And I have some thoughts about that deck I think it's fine. I think that there's just like, overall, the quest in Hammer these days is, so there was an era where the key to the deck was just trying to make the most consistent deck that bonked them. And I think that era is over with all the interaction, and you're trying to like balance the like having the best draws possible with having the like least mulligans possible, because the deck does mulligan a lot. I think Ancient Stirrings is like a decent attempt to kind of balance that. I think the Ingenious Smith Portable Hole thing is a interesting thing to balance that with. I'm a pretty big fan of the Crusher Bot version now that I've put some reps in with it, and it's like actually pretty good at doing like, it has this whole thing where like you don't have Lurrus, but like you almost have a companion Nettlecyst based on the way the deck plays out. So I think there's a lot of ways to go about that are worth discussing. And it's notable that all the hammer lists that I've kind of seen pop up have been doing something to try and work on that.
How do you feel about 80 card Yorion Hammer for the grindy matchups?
Okay, so what else is in this top 8?
There's a few decks to get to in a second, but I think worth noting just in closing on that this green version of Hammer, I wouldn't say is the stock version at this point, but it is a stock version. And don't be surprised when your opponent leads on Temple Garden, and if they do, don't assume, well, okay, that means it's not Hammer, it must be, I don't know, Boggles or whatever the next most likely Temple Garden Lurrus deck is.
Yeah. So moving on down, we do have a Bring to Light, Scapeshift, that kind of 4-color pile deck that we've seen in the past. Arboreal Grazer showing up as just the best Mox Diamond of all time again. Have you put more work into this deck? Any thoughts? I mean, these are literally the same cards that it plays because it literally has to play all these. It's the same thing with, Titan, right? You just have to play like these exact like 30 spells and then you just have lands.
Right. I haven't put much work into it since I was high on it a few months ago. I do think it may be poised for a small comeback here, where if the format is getting into this place where it's Shadow on one hand versus these 4-color piles on the other, and in theory that's squeezing out the linear decks, although Bob49 would beg to differ there, then I think this deck is how you go over the top of the 4-color decks, and then also you have this consistent-ish, like turn 4 Goldfish, or you can Bring to Light for some kind of tool that surgically demolishes any given opponent. I think this is a good way to be proactive, but then also, outgrind the granny decks and beat them at their own game. And this list, you have this 1-2 punch of Arboreal Grazer and Expressive Iteration making its way into the main deck, where Iteration is just increasingly proving itself in every single constructed format, and any deck like this should, at the very least, consider and try that card. And I think it is very good here, both because you do care about just raw card count when you have like not just Grazer, but also Dryad of the Elysian Grove. And then on top of that, it's a good way to dig for Valakut to assemble that 1-2 combo there. And then once you have Grazer in your deck, Grazer is the card that gives you that speed and that, early blocker against stuff like Burn and Hammer and so on. But then it puts you down a card and you need to recoup that somehow. And that curve of, Grazer into Iteration maybe is actually a good way to kind of hedge your bets there.
I just want, did you describe Grazer and Iteration as the 1-2 punch of like go down a card, go up a card, you're neutral?
I may have done, yeah.
Okay, I wanted to call that out. I guess the other thing that's kind of going for this deck is a lot of the other 4-color decks are kind of folding back in on Icefang Coatl as a way to attack the Shadow deck, and that's kind of been what's trying to push that deck out of the meta. And I think that specific angle is like, you're just kind of making yourself even weaker to decks that have some kind of combo component, which makes this a little more attractive as opposed to like, I don't know what the other flex slot card is, but if the other like 4-color decks start being just about as interactive as you, having Bring to Light can kind of be, and like if they're just like, they got like some Dovin's Vetoes and Omnas, are you really that far ahead of them? Even if you just have like 4 sorcery speed cards that win the game, like, is that just like really that far ahead? But as soon as they start, playing more spot removal, then you're just hitting them on the axis of like, well, you just drew bad cards and my deck is all good cards.
Yeah, this is also a nice Veil of Summer deck. That's a card that is good against both the 4-color piles and any lingering blue-white mages, and then also the Shadow decks on the other end of that spectrum. So I think this deck also benefits from Cascade mostly dropping off, although maybe starting to come back. And then also Hammer is like, it's not a terrible matchup, but I think you do need to prepare for it quite heavily. And that deck going from, most popular deck by far to one of the most popular decks is a nice change there too. Rounding out this top 8, we have one of these 4-color decks in the hands of Zack Attack 23, who won the modern showcase qualifier for what the event would have been this weekend, and then back at it, making it into the top 8 here. So one of these players who you see consistent results from across the board, but in particular with this 4-color deck, just really finding success with that and tuning it week in, week out.
Yeah, I mean, that's been Zach's jam for a while. So I guess anything else in this PTQ, or should we move on to the challenges? Or is there really anything going on in those challenges that is distinctly unique from these kind of exact same results? I know there was a Yogmoth winner and top 8, but like Demonic Tutors is in the top 16 of this exact PTQ with Yogmoth. So that deck's just putting up some acceptable results across the board.
Yeah, it went from just Demonic Tutors doing well with the deck to the deck just putting up a lot of results on the whole, but then a solid half of those results are still just Demonic Tutors, like this one person consistently crushing with it. So hard to say exactly where it fits in the format right now. I think the big question for me there is, how good is it actually against the Shadow decks on the one hand and the 4-color decks on the other, where I've heard arguments for and against Yogmoth in both of those matchups, and that seems to be what matters right now, because the Hammer matchup, wherever you come down on that, is mostly a known quantity at this point. And then on the other side of things, you have all of these weird fringe decks, whether it's, Belcher, which increasingly is less and less fringe, or other stuff where, that's just modern in a nutshell for you. But those two fair matchups in particular, I think, are what matters for a deck's viability. That has become a litmus test of the format. And I just honestly don't know how Yogmoth stacks up against either of those.
Let's see. It's been a while. This has been the deck that's been on my list of let's get back to playing that. But then I've been sidetracked down Rakdos Vampires and playing 87 different Hammer variants. My experience is generally that the controlling matchups like the 4-color deck are decent. They can interact, but you force them to interact with your random stuff, and then once the Yogmoth resolves, you actually just get a lot back out of it, and it's kind of tough. The Shadow matchup, I would describe, having played from the Shadow side, it is very, I don't know what who is favored, but it's very binary in outcome. You can stop them from it's the traditional creature combo versus Shadow thing. This was the whole thing that when Shadow first came to exist in Modern in its current form, it really existed in part to just crush the Obzon Company deck that was big at the time. And the difference is the Yogmoth deck has the Yogmoth, when it resolves, does a lot more things and catches them back up into the game. But if you just cut that off, their creatures are okay at blocking, but sometimes they're on the noble hierarch half of their deck. It's like I said, it's hard to tell percentages, but it's a very lights on, lights out, very binary result kind of thing, where it's no one is ever really oh yeah, it was really close to this. It's oh no, I almost won and then the game immediately ended, or I took no relevant game actions kind of thing.
Yeah, I think looking down the rest of this Saturday challenge, it's more of the same. It's a lot of Hammer and Shadow and Murktide. We've got some 4-color in here. Wafo Tapper fighting the good fight with Blue Eye Control, and then Ardos fighting some kind of fight with Ad Nauseam. Yet again, just sneaking into another top 10.
Yeah, I guess I like this deck slightly more because there's slightly less Teferis, but I mean, very slight, basically 0 more. I really I cannot advise people to play this deck because it's been going on 7 to 8 years of being tricked into playing this deck, and every time it's equally as bad as the last one.
Funny thing I noticed here is in 22nd place, we have Fluorospar with the Imperial Recruiter Humans deck, which has been, floating around the orbit of the format for a while now. And as part of the Recruiter toolbox, we have one of Torak Dreadcantor, which seems oddly out of place in your mostly all of the other colors Humans deck. But when you look at the mana base and you have Ancient Ziggurat, that's a Rainbow land, Cavern of Souls, Unclaimed Territory, well, both of those 5-color lands in this deck. 4 Silent Clearing as as your canopy land of choice, making a statement about what your main colors are here. That card actually is surprisingly castable. It doesn't work with Aethervour in the way that you'd like, the way that the adversary cycle does, for example. But I just thought that was a fun twist to focus on.
Yeah, I mean, there's 2 more Toroks in the sideboard, so you just can really mean it when you need a protection from white creature. But yeah, I guess all your lands do technically cast that. And that includes Ziggurat kicking it. So I guess, yeah, sure, why not? 5 colors.
Yeah, we also have Cadwin Farbosa in 25th place, another Toronto local and frequent Magic Online grinder with the 4-color Enigmatic Incarnation deck, which we spoke about a little bit in previous episodes. And this also has 4 copies of Showdown of the Skulls. So I guess the gimmick here is you're going to play this high-impact enchantment on turn 4 and then just do a bunch of weird, unique stuff. And hopefully that stuff is enough to, thread the needle that you need to thread.
I really enjoy how the Magic Online deck display is still like unable to Lurrus. Like there's just an other Lurrus and you're like, oh, is that the companion? No, this is an 80 card Yorion deck. There's just like another card. It's Lurrus. Doesn't even recognize that it's a real Magic card, which may be the correct stance to take on it, but
Yeah, it was somehow able to conceptualize the one main deck copy of Yorion and Sky Nomad, but the one Lurrus there just completely blew its mind.
Yep, just completely. Yeah, I forgot about that aspect of this deck where it has like the companion toolbox, but also a companion.
Yeah, I really enjoy seeing these companions show up in these relatively fair contexts, and I think it's mostly just the two that you see most commonly anyway, right? It's just Lurrus or Yorion, and you're not seeing that many just like random Gyrudas showing up or Giganthas or any of the others, and maybe that's a good reason for that.
I mean, I guess Gyruda is like self-perpetuating, but like really most of these cards are just in your deck for the value prospect, and like the 2 best ones are the 2 best value prospects, which mean that they're just like the best cards to put in your deck as normal cards.
Yeah, and then Sunday Challenge, we have Laplacian, I want to say. Got to learn to pronounce that name at some point because we're going to be talking about them a lot. Just constantly either winning challenges, top 8 challenges, putting up great finishes, with Orzhov Hammer beating Orzhov Hammer in the mirror in the finals here. And then you look down the rest of this top 8, Murktide, 4-color, pretty clear where the format is at this point.
Yep. I mean, we know the good decks. We've gone through this cycle with Azorius Control. We know how the decks are fighting back against it. There's some like back and forth in terms of what's going on there. And I think that really we're just kind of in this orbit around the control decks where like every week they pop up a little bit more, a little bit less. And I think that's the current back and forth game that people are playing with, again, the same half dozen or 10 good decks.
Yeah, so not much notable here other than sneaking into the top 32. We have one of M. Hayashi's sleeper agents with 4 Hammer of Bogodan, 4 Reckless Impulse, 4 main deck Relic of Progenitus, 4 Bloodstone, 4 Den of the Bugbear. Some of you have heard this one before.
I have not. So, I mean, I guess I can stop you if you want to stop, but the Hammer of a Garden thing over Firebolt still gets me. I do not understand it, but it's a decision you're allowed to make.
I want to live in a world where that is a choice that makes any amount of sense if you're trying to maximize your chance of winning games. We do not live in that world, but I kind of love to see it for precisely that reason.
Yeah, I mean, as long as you play with the Mirage blackboarded one, I think you're in the clear.
Does that version even exist on Magic Online?
Yeah, Mirage was a set.
Okay. Yeah, it's Hammer is the kind of card which was getting power crept out of being a viable grindy endgame in like 2001, and here 20 years later you have like this small band of dedicated disciples still trying to make fetch happen.
Yeah, to put things in context, when it was reprinted in 8th edition, it ended up in a standard deck that I played, and then we just cut it for Fireball because at the point that you can hammer people, you could just tap all of your lanes and win the game instead.
Yeah, so that's a decent summary of where Modern is at right now. We'll take a break and come back with where Modern used to be, headlined by a few offenders in particular, and where Modern might be headed in the future, depending on unbans. We'll see you in a second. If you want to buy Magic the Gathering cards, you know we have you covered, but if you want to sell them, that's never been easier too. With a 30% store credit bonus and the fastest turnaround time in the industry, there's no reason to sell anywhere else. Go to starcitygames.com/sell and pick one of 4 convenient ways to sell your cards to us. You can use our buy list, you can ship your cards to us, you can come to us in person in Roanoke, Virginia, and if you have an entire inventory that you want to offload, we can come to you. Go to starcitygames.com/sell for more information. All right, so let's get into the meat of this episode here, and that is, of course, the Modern ban list. Our favorite topic, the community at large's favorite topic. And so continuing on the split that we had from before, where we spoke about some of the more recent bans, cards which were in the Modern format for some length of time, but then were taken out of it, justly or unjustly, and found their way into the Modern ban list gauntlet. We're back here now with, I guess to kick this off, cards which were on the very first iteration of the Modern ban list, but then were set free after it was judged I think correctly in basically all cases that, they weren't as, they were past their prime a little bit.
Yeah, we're going to start with the things that have been unbanned since then. Talk about like the initial ban list. And I think this is a good place to start because it sort of sets the stage for talking about what an unban might even like. What's the purpose of an unban? What's the good cases for an unban? For then the other like effectively like 11 cards from the original ban list that are still on there. So I guess let's start off the top with Bitter Blossom, which I think is kind of like a show of where Magic has gone in general. That card, when Modern started, it was just like a different game. We'll just put it at that.
Yeah, many of these cards. So when we spoke to Tom Lapilli for the Pro Tour Philly 10-year anniversary special, he said that a lot of these cards they didn't think would be broken or even that good in this nascent Modern format, but they had been so obnoxious in Standard and the extended format that Modern was replacing that they didn't want any risk that the best cards there would just be the best cards yet again and sap some of that momentum that the new format had. And so as this preventative measure, Bitter Blossom and then Ancestral Vision and some of these other cards were axed with the understanding that probably that didn't need to happen and maybe some of them could work their way back into the rotation after a while.
I do think Bitter Blossom would have been very, very good in the early days of Modern. I think that the only thing like I guess like the PT Philly era, yeah, whatever. You're gonna like undercut a Bitter Blossom. Wild Nacatl was kind of the biggest issue for it when it came back, and also like would have been for a bit there. But I think post those bans, like Fairies would have probably been one of the best decks in the format. At least I'm thinking of people would have figured out Tron, and that would have been a problem. But I think that the thing that has changed is in that era, the like 2 to 3 to 4 drop creatures were a lot more about like they got into combat or like didn't get into combat. Like it was one or the other, and you ended up in a spot where like if they got into combat, Bitter Blossom could like force field them down until like Cryptic Command took over the game. If they didn't get into combat, they just got raced by Bitter Blossom. And as like the curve on those creatures has pushed down over the years and they've started like hybridizing functionality, you're actually in this point where like Bitter Blossom is not just this unmatched card advantage engine where it gets to do that. I'm trying to think of like the right example because it's like Ragavan is clearly not the right example for lining up against Bitter Blossom. I don't know. Can you think of something that like really exemplifies like the difference there in terms of like what Bitter Blossom did then and what it could be now?
So there's an interesting case study that comes to mind, which is in the very early days of Companion, when Grixis Delver with Lurrus was by far the best deck in Legacy, once again, in a tier of its own. Bitter Blossom became the go-to sideboard card for the mirror, and then also against some of the blue decks trying to attack Delver, where if they're loading up on like Swords to Plowshares and Hydroblast or Pyroblast or what have you, then Bitter Blossom just kind of jumped through all of that, and then also was, could be force filled against Delver, or you could just wait a turn and then Delver couldn't attack into your wall of flyers anymore, and everything lined up perfectly to where that was the best tool you could play that also happened to be compatible with Lurrus at the same time. Also thinking historically about like the card roll in Extended, where you had smaller Extended, the later four block Extended formats where just the standard Fairies deck was one of the best decks you could play, and it kind of was built and played out in the same way as the standard version did. But then before that, when you had the larger iteration of Extended, you had, for a time, Fairies being like one of the best decks, but without Bitter Blossom. It was just strictly mono blue. And then when other contextual factors in the format led you to want to move back to this more kind of classic standard version of the deck, then you got to Bitter Blossom, and that was one of the reasons to do it. But you almost got there accidentally. This wasn't one of the strong incentives to play Fairies the way that you might expect it would be.
Yeah, that had more to do with the texture of like elves, which we'll probably talk about a little later. Spoiler alert. But yeah, it is a very powerful card. It just has to exist in a context where, like I said, Wild Nacatl was the issue, where like people are like not undercutting it or like going over it in very specific ways. Like if your opponent's just like doing some things, Bitter Blossom will destroy them. But like Modern is not really about just like arbitrarily doing some things.
Yeah, I can imagine it being weirdly good against like Murktide with the right support, where good against Ragavan, assuming Ragavan hasn't done its damage by then. It can turn Murktide from 8 damage a turn into like 1 damage a turn, and that's a trade-off you're happy to make. And then if you have Graveyard Hate backing it up, you can like force a Channeler to attack into your wall of 1/1s and then shrink it to a 1/1 once it's had to make that commitment. So it actually lines up curiously well against most of the threats from that deck. But then also you look at what some of the other decks in the format are doing, and it's, this thing has Colossus Hammer and Shadow Spear attached to it. And so Bitter Blossom can't even force field that. Or it's even some of the other creature decks, it's like, or other fair decks, the 4-color decks, Bitter Blossom versus Omnath isn't really a fair fight, right? Or just some of the other stuff they're doing. And so I think Bitter Blossom is very good when either everything else that's going on just isn't fundamentally that powerful, or it's so powerful that it all kind of shrinks down to this very low resource kind of game where Bitter Blossom can take over. And I don't think either of those conditions is really true in Modern as it stands right now.
Yep. And I think moving on to the next card, I think Ancestral Vision is like even more of that. I believe that this was banned specifically because the overextended sort of precursor to Modern showcased that like it was powerful. There was like this Bloodbraid Elf Vendilion Click deck that was winning. It does not sound very good. And I honestly don't think that this card would have been that good at any point of Modern's existence, except in the sense of like, if it was even slightly good, the games where it was good would be relatively unfun, because there was a period with Twin where like it would be used in an unfair deck that's like partly, it's just like it would have been like, that's the only thing I could think of where like you would end up in a spot where like you couldn't take action because the Twin player could twin you, but if you didn't take action, like they would just vision you. I don't know. I'm really speculating here. I really don't think this card would have ever been an issue in Modern, and it just like falls into this category of like card that was banned because it was good elsewhere.
Yeah, I remember back to in the immediate aftermath of Pro Tour Philly, people saying like, what are the steps you need to do to make blue control even remotely playable? And if you free Ancestral Vision, does that help with that? Turns out I think the answer would have been not even close, regardless of how you slice it there. But this is a card which really has not aged at all well in Modern Magic, not just because, even if you suspend it on 1, you die before you get to unsuspend it, or you are effectively dead, if not literally dead, by that point, so much more than you used to be. But then also, like, there's an obvious Teferi Time Raveler issue in the present day, Chalice of the Void, stuff like that. Drown the Lock, even as a card which is pretty popular now. And it's just, like, you can go up on cards so much more easily and in a much less conditional way. Like, I'm not sure what the deck looks like that really wants this over, like, Expressive Iteration, for example.
Yeah, that's like a pretty clear nail in the coffin. Okay, so I think these next 4 cards that have been unbanned, there's 6 total from the original list, are actually like worthy discussions, not just like on power level about like what makes a good unban. And I think Valakut the Molten Pinnacle is an interesting case study where like I think that if Tron had not been discovered during that first season of Modern play, I don't think Valakut would have been unbanned.
Huh. So what's the connective tissue there?
I think that the reason Valakut was banned was like the very polarized gameplay it created, where like the standard gameplay of Valakut where you had Primeval Titan was just like the action would occur where you would Primeval Titan, or like the extended 4 block one where you had Scape Shift. It was just like the thing happened or your deck did nothing. And Tron was just like even more polarized along that axis. And I don't think they would have reintroduced Valakut into the format that soon if it was not discovered that you just had that existing in the format already.
Yeah, and so I think there are 2 things going on there. You have the issue that Tom Lapilli mentioned of we don't want the best decks here to just be the same best decks. And in the case of Valakut, you have 2 different Valakut decks, the standard-ish like red-green Primeval Titan version, and then also the extended blue Scapeshift combo control version, which you could just copy and paste into that early Modern format, and both of them would have been not good at the outset, but like once the format settled after that first wave of bans, both of those would have been very good decks. And then what we saw was in 2012, in the run-up to Pro Tour Return to Ravnica, this was one of the changes they made to shake up the Modern format, is unbanning Valakut. And So that set off this whole discussion going into the tournament of how real is Scapeshift in either of those two forms and what do you need to do to beat it? And so that is a deck which I think was a good safety valve against Tron in particular, where that was a very difficult matchup for Tron. And you saw people, like, I think Cedric went to lengths as extreme as like splashing Slaughter Games in his Tron sideboard just to have any hope in hell of beating Scapeshift. And so I think the card made a very positive contribution to the format initially, and mostly has done over time. I think it actually became less interesting once just classic standard style red-green Valakut became a viable deck. And I don't know exactly what the turning point was there, but that's a deck where the play patterns are quite repetitive because your deck is literally as redundant as possible and just tries to do the same thing every game. And also not that easy to attack through conventional means, where against Burn, which also is this hyper-redundant linear deck, if you want to play a bunch of different life gain cards against Burn, you can do that. If you want to prepare for Valakut specifically, then there's a reason that heavy-duty land destruction is not a thing that they encourage in Modern. And some of it like crept in just because the card pool is large enough that some of those changes hadn't been made in the very early 2000s yet. But for the most part, like without specialized stuff like Alpine Moon, which I think was partly a nod to Valakut and Urza's Tower, among other things, this is a deck which you have to kind of like just grit your teeth and slog through, or to go over the top of. And it's the classic example of like, if you want Modern to, or if you want fair strategies to be good in Modern, this is a deck which dunks on fair decks and then gets dunked on by unfair decks. So it kind of punishes that from both ends there.
Yeah. I think that the specific turning point for those decks being playable in Modern was like not just the banning of Twin, but the decline of Twin just before the ban as well. I want to say like the highlight finish is Tianwen top 8ing GP Pittsburgh in late 2015, just before the Twin ban. But yeah, I think that your description of it being like this cap on what's going on in the format was something they were trying to avoid. And I think that once the format was clearly defined as like, no, there are decks going to be going under Valakut. I think that like naturally, without like any other pressures being placed on it, I think that may have been the other like safety valve where it was like, okay, we can take this off the list.
Yeah, nowadays the conduct is slightly different, where the most common time you see Valakut is in decks with either actual 0 mountains in it in the form of Amulet Titan, or just enough mountains that you can technically legally kill them via Scapeshift, but you're never manually triggering this thing in the way that you were back in 2016, 2017 through Farseek into another Farseek into Primeval Titan.
Yeah. I think it's best to discuss these next two cards as a pair because they were banned in Standard as a pair. And they have like similar ramifications as a pair in terms of like how they fit into Modern. And that is Jace the Mind Sculptor and Stoneforge Mystic, where unlike a lot of the previous cards, I think there's actually a long period of time where these cards would have been too good for Modern. Specifically with Stoneforge Mystic, if you look at the brief period between when it was unbanned and the printing of War of the Spark, which I think was like, I'd have to look up exactly the dates on that. I'm looking this up right now because I really want to know. The card was like really, no, it was after. Wow, I had this the other way around. Huh.
Yeah, I think you have Jace and Blood Raid coming off at the same time, as I recall, in like, I want to say February 2018. And then Stoneforge Mystic was part of the I guess like apology tour for Modern Horizons 1. Whereas, okay, well, we banned Hogak for real this time. And then also here's a treat to make up for that.
Okay, well, I think my point still stands. The point I wanted to make is that I don't think Stoneforge Mystic in a pre-Modern Horizons 1 Modern makes any sense. I think that very specifically, Stoneforge Mystic fits in with the like 2019 and forward era of cheap threats where they just like, like the Bone Crusher Giant model, where like the card just is like a big thing that does everything. And like is card advantage, but like also forces removal. Like, I don't think it fits in with the previous era where like you're supposed to like give the lower end threats some time to breathe and not have them face down against like this must kill thing in the way that like, yeah, if you have to kill a Goyf, like it's a clean solution. But if you kill the Mystic, you're still facing down the Batterskull 3 turns later. I don't think that could exist before Modern Horizons 1. I think in the aftermath of that, it makes sense. And Jace is I want to say similar, but it's like along the lines of War of the Spark, where I think this is something I've said before on the show, and I'll probably keep saying, but I think that the increased power of planeswalkers in older formats was actually like before this latest push to bring like Ragavans and Dragon Rage channelers into the format. I think that before like the 1-drops were too good, giving people reasons to include various creatures in their deck because they could pressure planeswalkers and interact with them without specific 1-for-1 removal that like always ends up behind was actually like pretty important. And Jace was like the start of that, like a full year before War of the Spark really continued down that trend.
Yeah, I think Jace, more than maybe any other card, is the perfect encapsulation of just how things are different these days, because I can't imagine times where Jace legitimately would have been throttling the format if it had been released too early. And going back to that very early modern discussion of how do we make blue playable, I think Jace maybe would have been an overcorrection in like the immediate aftermath of PC Philly if they had done it then. So I think I'm glad that they held off because you can imagine like Twin with Jace being even more obnoxious than just Twin without Jace would have been, or Jace by itself like is a powerful enough incentive to build your blue deck around it that everything else kind of flows from there. The same way that, you know, Nihiri the Harbinger was for like a 4-week period in 2016 and then never since then. But nowadays, you most often see Jace in the sideboard of Is It Murktide decks, but you think about how the threats in that deck line up against Jace, where, you know, you play Jace. Okay, well, do you brainstorm? Because if you do, the channeler that's in play is just going to attack it down. Do you bounce the channeler? Well, then you know, Dash Ragavan kills it, or if the threat in play is Ragavan, you can't bounce that because, well, that's just an on-board move at that point. And when the threats are all so cheap that bouncing them doesn't feel like you've just cast Time Walk and still have a Jace in play, then a lot of the appeal of the card kind of drops off. And I think it's very notable that you saw this card and Bloodbraid Elf set free alongside each other, where that was the dynamic and standard of Bloodbraid Elf as this hasty Moldrifter, keeping Jason in check there. I think the hope was that those two cards would act as checks on each other in Modern as well. It turns out at the time, neither one of those cards was actually that good in practice. And so everything else in the format was a big contributor to that instead. But I think Jace is an interesting card to analyze in the context of current Modern, where just it's a quite a fragile card, and just costing 4 mana is a bigger mark against it than anything else, as compared to a few years ago, where you could happily put these various 4-drops in your deck as your endgame and expect to get there most of the time.
I thought Jace was pretty good when it was unbanned, but I generally agree with that. And just with the format speeding up, I cannot. It's just like a good card to have as a big punish if your opponent is not attacking you. Just really, it's playing a great role now.
Stoneforge Mystic is maybe another curious one too, where I expected that card to be pretty obnoxious, supported by some of the other MH2 stuff. Like this is one of my biggest misses from that previous season. I thought a deck like Blue-White Stoneblade with a bunch of, you know, pitch elementals and spell quellers and stuff and force negation, that was going to be one of the decks to beat. And that just, I guess you saw some of that in like week 1, but past that point, it just never showed up again. And nowadays, Stoneforge Mystic is this weird like combo enabler plus backup plan in the aggro combo deck that's also the best deck, but it almost feels like an afterthought in that deck at the same time.
Yeah, Stoneforge Mystic is a fine power level compared to like Ragavan and Dragon Rage Channeler. That's really all I have to say about the card now. It's interesting to me how little Cauldra, whatever complete or whatever the name of that mythic is. I don't know why. I'm forgetting it because it's just not in decks anymore. It's very interesting how little of it is in Modern. I think it's just because, I mean, some of it is Luris, but like some of it is just like, how often is that better than like a Nettlesys?
Right. I think Cauldra is quietly one of the more obnoxious cards from MH2 that we don't understand in that way because it just doesn't show up enough to annoy people enough, because literally the only application of that card is to make Stoneforge Mystic into even more of a literal feast or famine play, where either you untap with your Stoneforge Mystic and it's hard to lose the game, or your Mystic dies and now you have a 7-drop that you're never realistically casting, versus something like Battleskull, where, you know, Stoneforge into Batterskull with protection, still a very strong play. But then if your Stoneforge dies, then you can, in theory, work towards the Batterskull as its own, self-contained endgame there.
Yeah, I wonder how much of this is the fact that Giver of Runes has kind of not panned out in the format, and therefore you don't have the legacy play pattern of Mother of Runes into Stoneforge Mystic, and then Cauldron is just going to happen.
Mm-hmm. One card that you can, in theory, find with Stoneforge Mystic, and we saw people trying some amount of this across the years, is Sword of the Meek. So this is another card on the very first iteration of the modern ban list, and it took quite a while for that one to come off. It was freed, I think, alongside Ancestral Vision, right, in 2016, and I love to see that based on my own experiences with the card in Extended, and it felt like at the time the card was playable and you could build decks around it, but it wasn't obnoxiously good. And then this was also a period where Mox Opal was a remarkably narrow card in the sense that, okay, you played it in Affinity and it was clearly very good there, but this gave you a reason to build just a Mox Opal deck that did anything else. And I think it was welcome for that, if nothing else.
Yeah, I think that the big lesson with this card is that making people spend mana to do things to win the game is generally a fine cap in Modern. You start running into issues with the ways that the 2-card combos that don't involve spending mana. The Sword of the Meek combo is fairly resilient to Artifact Hate, fairly resilient to Graveyard Hate, just through some of the auxiliary stuff that shows up. It's just, it costs mana. I mean, you do, even playing with it in recent Modern, you do win the game once it gets going a fair amount of the time, because it beats a Murktide Regent pretty straightforward and all this other stuff. But I think that there's just a cost to Assembly in terms of what's going on beyond making the tokens that is tough to pay.
Yeah, it just feels so much clunkier than it has in the past, and the loss of Mox Opal is absolutely a big deal there. So in the Wurza decks, which I think were briefly a dominant deck in Modern, but so much else was going on at the time that it was never really framed as in the same category as some of those other best decks. There was still a gigantic gulf between the draws with Mox Opal and the draws without in terms of how fast you could get this combo going. And I do wonder if, let's say we had that Mox Opal for Urza Saga swap, I think the rest of the format looks very different, but I wonder how big of a part, though, that kind of generation of Wurza decks would be playing in the format right now.
It would probably be pretty good. I think that they'd be, answerable, but they'd be pretty good.
Yeah. So I don't think we're going to ever get to indulge our hypothetical. What do you think it would take for Thopter Sword in some capacity to work its way back into the top tiers of Modern? Is it just more reasons to put Urza in your deck and then this is downstream of that? Or is there something else that comes to mind there?
No, I think that's literally about it. I think that the article I wrote a couple of weeks ago exploring why Urza is good right now is a good start down the road of why this deck could come back. And I don't really know exactly what the missing piece is, but it's something along the lines of Portable Hole, but not in the exact space. So that you get to play this sort of actual control deck that incidentally enables its own synergies along the way. I think that's literally just the missing component, is just another card of that type.
Yeah, there are a few more dangerous artifacts on this list. Should we get rid of 5 of them in one go here?
Yeah, so we're going to start talking about cards that have not been unbanned. And I think a lot of these initial bans are things that probably shouldn't be unbanned. The artifact lands are ones that always come up in discussion. I am relatively not okay with them. I think that if you look at Pauper, you start to see a lot of the downstream effects of what happens when these cards are unbanned. I don't entirely know what the result is in Modern, but I don't know what is the good outcome. And that's the two questions we had laid out last time for unbans is what is the good and bad outcome, and are these cards too good? I think it's more unclear with artifact lands than any of these, because there's so many things that fall out of that. But what is the good outcome besides people stony silencing and no one ever casting a spell?
Yeah, I think some people look at specifically Pauper and they see the artifact dual lands that are indestructible from MH2, and it's well, those cards are legal in Modern and see no play. And are these really that much better? And the answer is yes, absolutely, categorically. Just being an untapped land is important in general in a format where efficiency is an absolute focus, but specifically in the decks that tend to make the best use of the artifact lands. They tend to be these quite low curve decks that are looking to really maximize all of those like small synergies, and being untapped is crucial there. Whereas, in theory, you could play the artifact dual land of choice in your hammer deck, for example, but there are very good structural reasons why that's never going to happen.
Yeah, I think that maybe if they were unbanned, the immediate deck I would jump to is something similar to the 8 cast decks from Legacy and Vintage. I think that the biggest payoff would be Thought Monitor, which is like a really good card if you get to play it for cheap. The problem is that the current affinity decks can't really do it that well without playing tap lands that mess everything up along the way. But if you're just like naturally making 2 effective mana a turn for that card, that's probably where you end up. Maybe, a lot of these other cards also have like secondary implications, like, Emery in terms of like artifact lands and setting up maybe like Underworld Breach and Sigh along the way. So I maybe this is one where I just like have to sit down and play games. I just think that like very specifically the way the answers line up in Modern, you end up in like a pretty unfun middle ground of like, I think that the current affinity decks and things of that sort are like, they're like, they get hit a bit by the artifact hate, but the games are not super binary. And I think as soon as you introduce the artifact lands, it ends up in this really bad spot where it's just like, going back to the like they have it or they don't kind of thing.
Yeah, it becomes this really unhealthy arms race where if these decks are good enough, then you can't just rely on accidental graveyard hate, your Prismari commands of the world and that sort of thing. You need the heavy duty stuff. And so it quickly devolves into, if I find my Stony Silence, Collector Oof, Con the Great Traitor, Force of Vigor, what have you, then that just absolutely cripples them, and I probably win the game with that one play alone, or I don't draw those and the game isn't competitive in the other direction and I just get run over. And both sides of that are kind of unsatisfying. We talk about these as a group. Does it have to be all or nothing? Is there a way that you could unban, somewhere between 1 and 5 of these and not all of them at once?
Every time someone says that, I hate it. I don't know. Like, what are you accomplishing by unbanning Tree of Tales that you aren't accomplishing by like making a treasure vault?
I think the exact answer there is I get to have more fun playing Hardened Scales, but that seems a little too self-motivated for that analysis.
Ancient Den. Let's talk Ancient Den. What do you get by unbanning Ancient Den? I guess people activate Oswald with it.
Or, Pure Steel Paladin gets even stronger in the best deck already. Yeah. So that's actually, this is mostly just a thought experiment at this point, but what is the relative strength of the different artifact lands here? So we mentioned there's like an obvious existing home for Ancient Den, and so maybe that's the top of the list by default. Seat of the Synod would, I think, have the most like value over replacement for the blue artifact decks. The Thoughtcast and Thought Monitors of the world. Maybe Tree of Tales goes in Hardened Scales, that kind of thing. Does Vault of Whispers actually do anything, or is it basically just another treasure vault for the decks that would want that?
I think that the Disciple of the Vault is basically Hardened Scales, right?
Sure, yeah.
I'm interested. I guess there aren't like a ton of other things. I think that Vault of Whispers might be the biggest stretch. I would assume that Seed of the Synod goes back to being number 1. And I'm thinking more about the Treasure Vault situation. I think that may have been a test run to see if these are unbannable. I would not be shocked to see them unbanned in the future. Just thinking about the fact that we haven't seen any like 8 artifact lands decks doing very well. Like I said, I don't really know what the like upside of unbanning them is relative to just like, this is very similar to the Mox Opal thing where like you are just using these as an arbitrary way to reduce the cost of other artifact cards. And like, it's just more interesting to produce new cards that subsidize artifact synergies in other ways.
Yeah, it does feel like, let's say you unban specifically Vault of Whispers tomorrow. I don't think anything would really change in Modern. And if it did, it would probably be a little bit for the better. But that also does feel just too clever by half, right? It's like, okay, you can pat yourself on the back and you've found this very creative solution to a problem that maybe didn't exist in the first place. But the risk also is pretty high. And if it doesn't work, well, then it just looks even more boneheaded in some respects than unbanning all of them and see what happens.
Yeah, I think these just fall into like a narrow window of like maybe safe to unban, but like not really as interesting as you think it would be to be unbanned. So I think that like you probably have to have a lot happen to remove them from the list.
Mm-hmm. And so with that in mind, there are some more dangerous artifacts and more dangerous spells in general, or I guess even lands, that we can come back to here after a short break.
With this break, I'd like to talk to you about Star City Games Premium. For years, StarCityGames.com has been hosting the best Magic the Gathering strategy content on the internet, and Star City Games Premium is a huge part of that. If you want to see great articles from Pro Tour champions, world champions, and many other accomplished players, as that content comes hot off the presses, subscribe to StarCityGames.com Premium. More than that, Star City Games Premium comes with a host of benefits when shopping at StarCityGames.com. Premium members save 5% on Magic the Gathering sealed product, 10% on singles, and 15% on supplies. There's even special benefits on SCG Tour Online event entries to keep an eye out for when those events come around. All that savings and all that content costs just $7.99 a month. For the price of 2 booster packs, you can be on the cutting edge of Magic the Gathering strategy, getting insights from the best in the industry on Star City Games Premium.
Okay, let's go further down the list here with some cards that never saw the light of day in Modern, and perhaps a good reason here. So do we want to do this alphabetically? Do we want to group them thematically? How do we want to do this?
I'm just going to start off with Chrome Mox, and I would just like to note that Simian Spirit Guide is banned. Chrome Mox would do basically the exact same things as that card. It's pretty... People like to imagine all the fun they'd have like playing Dark Confidant on turn 1, and I really like that aspect of Chrome Mox, where like the format is turned into 1-drops, therefore you are subsidizing 2-drops. The problem is that you like in practice people do the worst thing possible, and that worst thing possible is like turn 1 Pentad Prism, turn 2 Balustrade Spy, or just like turn 1 Chalice of the Void, and like I don't think that the things that you are Chrome Mox is going to get into problems. It's just going to happen.
Yeah, Bob49 would be very happy if they woke up tomorrow and Chrome Mox was unbanned.
Yeah, I think that Modern is like very specifically pushing away from being the format with the 0 mana ramp. And maybe in a few years we'll look back and say maybe it's time for it, but it's really hard to imagine what's going to happen down the line that makes that. Like if you look at the free cards they have printed in the 2 Modern Horizon sets, aside from one that we talked about last time that was an oopsie free, it's a lot of stuff focused on putting the free into conditional interaction, which then like creates this sub game of like playing around it so that you don't get blown out. Whereas like with Chrome Mox, there's no playing around Chrome Mox. You just get Chrome Mox and they do their thing and like, I don't know, you just die.
Yeah, I do wonder, aside from the 0 land combo decks, what the actual home for this card would be. Because you can imagine some other combo decks that would want to play it, but I don't know what those combos would even be at this point, if any come to mind for you.
Urza and Chalice of the Void probably together. That would be my first guess.
Sure. Worth noting, you cannot, in fact, imprint Thopter Foundry on Chrome Mox, as I, saw happen at a PTQ back in the day. But yeah, you could build a color-heavy version of an artifact deck where Chrome Mox was, consistent enough to turn on, and then once it was just phenomenal. And then also, like alongside stuff like Emery, perhaps, where it both turbos out Emery, is a Lotus Petal off Emery, so to speak, and then if you draw like a backup Emery, that's the perfect thing to imprint on it. So something in that space, I'm sure, would be a natural home there. We did back in the day have control decks with like maybe a light artifact sub-theme, or not even that, where Chrome Mox was just accelerating out some high impact 2-drops, whether it was like Bitter Blossom or Spellstarter Sprite, back when you really wanted to be playing that on turn 1. And then you had like Thirst for Knowledge, which again kind of satisfied both ends of the, you can imprint this on marks, but then also discard the marks if you draw it later. Is there some kind of fair or controlling deck that you think would make a good home for that too?
It would probably be more horrible Chalice of the Void things, though I guess it makes a little more sense with Luris. Like that, like the Chrome Mox, Luris, Urza Saga trio would probably be kind of gross.
Yeah, this card alongside Expressive Iteration seems kind of messed up as well, right? Not that card needed any help, but the fact that, if need be, you can imprint Iteration and have this fully Rainbow Mox field deck, and then also it turbos that Iteration and then leaves you with a land drop left over, or it's the perfect card to Iteration into as your kind of free spell that has to be played this turn as well. So maybe something that would encourage a whole style of deck building in its own right. One thing that does occur to me is it is another free spell, and I don't think Modern does need more of that, but it's a free spell that doesn't work with a lot of the constraints that encourage other free spells. And so if you try to put this in a deck with like Force Negation and Solitude and so on, you quickly realize that once you draw and try to cast multiples of those, you've run out of cards already. And there's, you have to try and claw that back somehow. And with the way the format's going, with like 4-color over here and shadow over here, I think that is a very real cost.
Yeah, I mean, it also has this sort of like tension where like the purpose of the free spells is that like you get to take game actions when you don't have mana, but like if one of your free spells just makes mana, why not just like play cards?
Yeah. Also, Mox as a card in these like modern-ish formats, whether it's actual modern or extended, typically it sinks or swims based on how vulnerable it is to cards that people want to play anyway. And so now that Prismatic Ending is in the mix, and that can just tag a turn on Chromox, or Engineered Explosives, ubiquitous card in modern these days, Colligan's Command floating around, that sort of thing. It feels like the downside of Mox in that sense is very real as well.
Yeah, and that even points more towards the combo decks where like you're just like, well, I don't care, the game's over. Like I have cast Cathartic Reunion on turn 1. Good luck, have fun.
Yeah, I wonder if there is also some, like, is Chromox a good prowess enabler under some circumstances?
No, I think that going down on cards is just too much. Like, you may as well just play Gutshot, right?
Yeah, I'm thinking more of like, can you build a deck that's 4 Reckless Impulse, 4 Expressive Iteration, and all of the good 1-drops, and then just go from there?
Maybe in the context of those 2 specific cards, but I think it's more likely it would end up doing infect things.
Yeah. So I think Mox it's a really interesting card to consider in this context and to build decks with. I just don't know if the overall gameplay experience, once you let this card loose on the format, is going to be a good thing.
I think it just really overwrites what the modern format has kind of shifted its way into over the last 3 years. And I don't really think you want to go down that road with the cards that exist. So I guess next in line is a card that was often paired with Chromox, which is Dark Depths. I think when I said that specifically combos that make you spend mana in like specific setup ways are much more fine for modern, I was referring to this card. I mean, I think that the issue with this card in modern is not that like the average game involving Dark Depths is too short. It's just like it's very similar to the like, like the Splinter Twin problem where like most Splinter Twin games, they wouldn't combo you till turn 6, but the threat of it happening on turn 4 was a big thing. I think that there's a lot of the same thing where like the average Dark Depths kill isn't until like turn 3, turn 4, but like, there's a decent chance that it just happens on turn 2 or turn 3.
Yeah. So someone who has come up a fair amount on this podcast and frequent Twitter rabble-rouser Bilsiv had a thread where he just went through the top 10 cards on the modern ban list that are invalidated by Solitude. And I think that is an interesting framing to look at this whole discussion through. And Dark Depths understandably made the list. And it made me think that maybe it's not always exactly Solitude, but those free interactive spells may be actually a good safety valve against threats that don't exist yet because they haven't been allowed to exist. But now that they do exist, maybe, the idea of unbanning Dark Depths or, some of these other candidates becomes a little more palatable.
You know what my experience with Dark Depths in Legacy Hit was? When my opponent swords it, you know what happened? I gained 20 life and then made another Dark Depths like 4 turns later and they lost.
Yeah, I don't know if the infrastructure is really there to support that in modern, where like, yeah, in theory, you can Life from the Loam back this and Thespian Stage, but you don't have Mox Diamond here, right? You don't have Exploration. You don't have a lot of the stuff where, you can build the deck around that and just put all of your chips in the middle as early as turn 2 or turn 3. It's actually pretty hard to ramp this out in the context of modern unless you're doing the whole, turn 1 Urborg, turn 2 Dark Date into Hexmage thing.
I think Reclaimer and Yavimaya is probably enough to do most of the work, right? Like you just like turn 1 Elvish Reclaimer off of Yavimaya, sack your turn 2 land for a Dark Depths, and like you play a Thespian Stage and that's it.
Yeah. I think also Depths is one of those cards that maybe gets a lot better in formats like the one where modern is at the moment, where you see a lot of this in Legacy, where the interaction is so good and the threats are also so good that there's a lot of trading cards back and forth, and you need specific answers that line up against those specific threats. And then Dark Depths just comes along and says, hey, I'm a land, so already hard to interact with, and I make an indestructible 20/20, so very hard to interact with that. And then also I kill in one swing. And, if you're pairing this with Thespian Stage, most of my combo is uncounterable at the same time. And so there's actually very little that does line up well against Marrow Age, and specifically, with the format moving to Prismatic Ending over Path of Exile, or you look at these Grixis Shadow decks, right? And it's Unholy Heats and Drown of the Locks and stuff like that. Dark Depths just doesn't care. Dark Depths just does its thing and forces you to have exactly the right answers. And Solitude is one of those, admittedly. But there's not that much else that I can think of off the top of my head.
Yeah, and especially like a lot of this is in the context of Legacy where Wasteland exists, and just that card not existing is a problem whenever you start considering Dark Depths being legal. I don't think it's like entirely out of range of a future Modern format, but it's like pretty high end in terms of what it offers. Yeah,
there's also so like Urza Saga fetching stuff like Ether Spellbomb or Pithing Needle can help there, or you can, if Dark Depths was a part of Modern, you could reorient a lot of your decks around it, and maybe that would make for some interesting competing incentives. I just don't know exactly what the go-to Dark Depths deck would look like. Like without Chromox in particular, you don't have those super fast depth skills. And so maybe it is green, and so you go for like the Elvish Reclaimer Knight of the Reliquary style stuff, which could honestly use a little more support at this point.
Yeah, my guess is that it's a lot like the green-white decks in Legacy that are trying to do the like somewhat fair Dark Depths thing, and it just becomes effectively the same thing that we saw with Field of the Dead, where you had like the green-white Titan Field of the Dead deck. But like, I think that the card is just like a little too constrained. Like there's like an actual like scope in Modern in terms of like this big threat is big, but it's answerable. And this is just like, it's also like just big and like hard to answer and like fast some of the time that like, I don't really think that's the greatest thing in the world.
I can also imagine just some like very interactive black heavy deck that just gets a companion Lurrus and then rebuy back Hexmage, which is the one part of the combo that in theory you can interact with. And yeah, I just see maybe it ends up pushing more of the same, which is not where we need to get to.
Yeah, not really. Dread Returned, I think, is an interesting card, next on the list alphabetically. It is, I actually think that this card could largely be unbanned. I don't really think that it changes a lot of the dredge equation. I think that the problem is that like, I guess we'll talk about Golgari Grave Troll here, because that card was unbanned and then it was rebanned because, yeah, none of that. I think if anything, we're in a world where dredge should not be better. And I don't think these cards do anything other than to make dredge better.
Yeah, this is the issue ultimately, is that in theory, you could build some like really cool Young Pyromancer, Seasoned Pyromancer deck where you're discarding this card and then flashing it back at the same time and doing all of these cool shenanigans. In practice, what happens is your dredge opponent turns over half their deck on turn 3, and then they return Narcomoebas and some Bloodguards, and then sometimes you can actually beat that on the board. And that's part of why that's kind of what keeps dredge in check, is that you can just clean up a bunch of their mopey creatures and all of their other stuff, whether it's like Conflagrate or Creeping Shoal actually is the worst offender here because they just get that one on the house most of the time. If you can fight through the other stuff, then whatever else you're doing can win the game from there. With Dread Return in the mix, the whole dredge deck just becomes so much more linear, where the plan is just Dread Return back something that's unbeatable. And I don't know what that is necessarily. Maybe it's Grizzlebrand and then you activate that and just dredge the other half of your deck and find all your Creeping Chills, or it's without Bridge from Below, you don't have the Flamekin Zealot, Dragonlord Colligan style stuff that you had in Legacy. But what if it's just Iona, right? What if it's Elishnorn, or like you can just do the Scryfall search here for creatures that cost 7 or more in Modern, and you can find something suitable. I have faith.
Yeah, I mean, there's also the Balustrade Spy issue to bring into it, where like,
oh god,
it's less cards, and therefore that deck gets to do more things. I basically like what I said about Faithless Looting last week is like even more polarized with Dread Return, where like, I don't want this card in the format until you remove some things that probably could be removed from the format for good purpose. But then like, once you do that, is this even a card that does anything? I don't think that is maybe it's closer to Bridge from Below, where like, it's almost a non-card, and it's kind of fine to hang out here until like, like I said, unban it after you ban Balustrade Spy, Undercity Informer, and Stink Minute and Golgari Thug. But like, again, that's just like, sure, you have, created a non-card and life goes on.
Yeah, I think the Balustrade Spy deck may actually be a bigger issue in some ways than its application in Dredge, where part of the charm of that deck at the moment is a full quarter of your deck is taken up by this absurdly convoluted win condition of, I've got my Narcomoebas and those trigger Sword of the Meek, and then I get to exile 3 more artifacts and get back my Salvage Titan, and then that recurs my Vengevines, and we got some Creeping Chills in there to make up the numbers too. And if you draw enough of those, you get into some weird edge cases where you just can't win the game anymore, or your opponent gained enough life, or what have you. And if they get to fully economize all of that down to 4 Narcomoeba, 1 Dredge Return, 1 Thassa's Oracle, at that point the deck becomes so much scarier, and they get to load up on more griefs, more destructive interaction, more just whatever, and that is not a fun experience for anyone.
No, it's Dread Return is just subsidizing the worst things in Modern at a point where you're trying to move away from that. Okay,
let's move on to another scary card, but maybe one that's more up for debate here in Glimpse of Nature.
Yeah, I have not actually spent time goldfishing elves with this card in Modern. I will say that there is sort of an interesting discussion because a lot of what was going on with Glimpse in that era was Wirewood Symbiote based, where you were a lot of your short Glimpse terms were you would start from basically nothing and then go big, were involving that card, and the actual efficiency endgame involved Symbiote. I know all the Pro Tour decks had Grave Shot and Predator Dragon, but that was largely because in the mirrors those were slightly better, whereas once the format calmed down, the best kill condition involved Wirewood Symbiote and then Mirror Entity, which would turn your Wirewood Symbiote into an elf, and then you pick it back up with itself and go infinite with Metal Sentinels. That all said, I think so. The problem with elves is that I think the cap on a lot of these decks involves Fury, and I don't think Fury actually keeps Glimpse elves in check.
Yeah, because so often what would happen is they would start the turn with 1 elf or even just 0 elf sometimes, and then by the end of the turn, they would have 20 creatures in play and have drawn their entire deck, and there's no window in there for this sorcery speed removal to actually do anything. And then also, with Fury being such a big part of the format, you would see stuff like Barton Forge Tenders or some other ways to hedge against that card, and maybe Ranger Captain of Eos is a part of that equation at some point. And yeah, I think the loss of Wirewood Symbiote is a big deal there, where that really helped into making the baseline of Glimpse of Nature be Thoughtcast a lot of the time. And without that, the card has more inherent variance attached to it. You also don't have Birchlaw Rangers, which often was either good redundancy for Heritage Druid or actually better than Heritage Druid if you were kind of short glimpsing or trying to cast other colored spells. Sometimes you would draw a few cards and then just draw into a Thoughtseize and cast it, for example. So I think the Glimpse deck would have to be configured a little differently. I wonder if now that you have Realm Walker 2 as this card which is both a replacement for Glimpse and then also works very well with Glimpse, maybe that's enough together to push it over the line, but maybe that wouldn't entirely be a bad thing.
Yeah, I actually think this is in the realm of things I would be willing to explore. I guess my other question is are we happy with the? I think the question that you have to answer is you explored a bit and you say oh, maybe this is too good or not. But then would you prefer that to the Elves deck that exists now, or is are you meaningfully improving that? I think there's some questions to be answered, but it's possible that of the cards that are still banned, this might be the most reasonable one. It's close.
Yeah, I think there is an interesting dynamic here too, where the current crop of free spells actually works more in this card's favor than against it. So Solitude, for example, that one does actually have applications against stuff like Heritage Druid on the combo turn, but if you spend 1 mana for your combo piece and you drew a card, and they have to go down a card to cast Solitude, maybe that stops them from literally losing the game on the spot, but that doesn't feel like a great exchange for them regardless of that. And then, Force Negation, yeah, it hits Glimpse, but probably doesn't hit anything else in this elf deck, so don't even know if you can keep that one in your deck. And then on the flip side, this deck would get to make great use of stuff like Force of Vigor, right? Or Endurance. Force of Vigor in particular against stuff like Chalice of the Void, which would legitimately be a beating for this deck. I think that actually works more in L's favor. I guess stuff like Force of Despair would actually be a problem, or which you can go to as a safety valve here. But I think it's high risk and kind of high reward. The other thing too is in the 12 years since we've seen this card in an analogous format, the removal has become so much better. Where Fatal Push, Unholy Heat, just every color now has good cheap ways to interact with the 1-mana elves, which often you want to play in advance as setup. And so I think you could more effectively contain this deck. And maybe another card, which we'll get to on this list, would assist in that. But yeah, I think if I was looking to throw a cat among the pigeons, this is one of the cards I would look to on the current ban list. I just don't know if the risk versus reward really lines up there, though.
Yeah, I mean, if the deck is not really reliably killing on turn 2 the way that it could, I don't want to say reliably, but like enough that it was noticeable and extended, I don't think it's as big of a deal because like turn 3 where like you had to control some creatures is whatever. But like you said, the risk reward thing. But I've come around to this being a considerable option.
Yeah, and there's other stuff which isn't a part of the format now, but which you could circle back around to. So like, Lava Dart, for example. There was a time when I was kind of looking to bring the elf deck back, but the mere existence of Lava Dart just put that to rest permanently. If Glimpse of Nature came back, I think Lava Dart had a good chance of coming back too. Or, there's other more specialized stuff which you can turn to if beating this deck is a priority.
Yeah. Let's see. We have already mentioned Golgari Grave Troll. No, I think that like if a card has been unbanned and then rebanned, that's a sign that you should just like not touch it. Unless you end up in the Gush situation in Vintage where like it has been unbanned for more Vintage's history than it has been banned, but like it was never the correct choice. Let's talk about Hypergenesis because we have started seeing decks pop up that feel at least on the same realm as Hypergenesis. My issue is I think that the Hypergenesis, it's underrated how much the Hypergenesis deck starts to look like. I think the correct comparison is that it is the living end to the Glimpse of Tomorrow's deck, where like your deck is just like a stupid pile of nonsense, but like you don't have this constraint on what you're playing in terms of like, oh, I have to play all permanents. So like your Hypergenesis deck is probably just like a bunch of Griefs with Gristlebrand's and Archons and like a bunch of Force of Negations and things like that. And I cannot imagine a world where like making a more living end deck exist in the format is a good idea. This starts to approach what the Tybalt's Trickery deck was.
Yeah, this is it's either that or actually the Cascade into Valkyrie deck may be a good analog there too, where this is the most repetitive form of the all-in Cascade deck you can think of, where you don't even have those scrappy games where like your Bonecrusher Giant and your Brazen Borrower have to get the job done, or you start casting Curator of Mysteries and you hopefully cross the finish line. There's none of that. You don't get to play any kind of backup game here because your clunkers in your deck are Grizzlebrand, Archon Cruelty, Iona, Emrakul, what have you. And so you either cast Hypergenesis or you don't, and there's no in between. And so it's more one-dimensional in that regard. And then also there's kind of less counterplay from the other side too, where you can often beat the board against, certainly against Crashing Footfalls, but often against Living End, Glimpse of Tomorrow as well. You don't beat the board against Hypergenesis if they have constructed their threat base properly. And when you do, you didn't have any agency in that. It's you drew your one sideboard card, or you drew like your 3 copies of Solitude at exactly the right moment. There's no like bobbing and weaving around anything. It's just you both flop your hands on the table and see what happens.
Yeah, not a great card. Pretty not great to unban. Mental Misstep is a much more interesting discussion than this card because I think this is a card that you can get tricked into liking, and then you just like look at the history of what happens every time this card is really good, and it's like, oh, you don't really want that, do you?
You really don't. In theory, it's a way to punish the ever-increasing pool of good one-drops. So like, yeah, if every deck has a good free answer to Ragavan that's, more universal than Gutshot or whatever, then okay, great in theory, but in practice, we've seen this time and time again. The best misstep decks are just those same decks which pick up these cards, and now they're better in the mirrors, and then also better against a vast swathe of the format as a whole. And they just become, I don't want to live in a world where mental misstep is protecting Murktide Regent from Path of Exile, for example.
Yeah, I think that we've actually seen the inverse of this card play out, and it's a pretty good lesson, which is Ragavan and Dragon's Ray Channeler are super, super good 1-drops. It just happens that when there's these super good 1-drops, you can build a lot of different bases around them. But when the rule is you can't play the 1-drops in your deck unless you're overloaded in the specific way on them, you end up with just a really constrained metagame where your deck, all the decks are on one side of the line of all in on the 1-drops or actually legally not allowed to play 1-drops. And I don't think that is a good way. We talked about some of the issues of the cards that got unbanned in terms of potentially polarizing the format. I think Misstep being a literal free card means that it's actually impossible to end up in the spot where this would polarize the format, but it's a little not on the right side of efficiency. It's no, it's just always going to be there.
Yeah, this card crowds out every single second tier 1-drop you could possibly play, unless you're a full Captain of Souls deck or something, and maybe even then. So I don't even know what the example would be, but this hypothetical elf deck, right? Non-starter if Mental Misstep is a feature of the format, or really whatever your pet tribal deck is, probably, unless it's big structural flaw, keeping it out of Modern right now is that it doesn't have enough good 1-drops. This card invalidating all of your 1-drops just puts that deck to rest permanently as well. So I think this card it's easy to be seduced by it, like you said, and to think about how it could improve the health of the format. It never has, it never will. Let's stop trying to make this happen.
Yeah, on the same line, Sensei's Divining Top is on the list. I'm going to say nothing about it because I will save people's life clock time because they've lost enough of it to this card. We talked about eggs potentially being an issue last time. This card is automatically more of an issue than that, and I don't really care to think about it more than that. Cedric might fire us if we said we would.
If tournament logistics were not a concern and just general quality of life concerns, do you think this would be an interesting game piece to consider?
No, just not really. Okay. I think that in the intervening years, there have been too many additional things along the lines of tap top, take a game action involving top to turn it into an extra card, the paradoxical outcome stuff. To the point where I'm just not interested in it, even beyond the whole logistics issue.
Yeah, you have this card with Monastery Mentor or just prowess triggers in general, that kind of thing.
Counterbalance is still a card.
Sigh, yeah. Counterbalance, maybe you get around that by doing the Zenith Dryad Arbor thing where you just swap their places on the ban list, but then that feels like kind of a fudge and maybe a sign that this was a project that was doomed to fail in the first place. I don't know how good top Counterbalance would be. I think it would be pretty phenomenal right now. There's a little more counterplay against it than maybe there used to be. It doesn't invalidate onboard Urza Saga, but now I'm thinking Urza Saga in my Counterbalance deck where it just finds top and now I can just do the thing consistently every game. Maybe that's not so good either.
You're getting trapped. You're spinning the top right now. You need to exit that game and proceed to the rest of Magic.
Yeah, we're going to leave the Inception movie right here and move on to maybe another broken 1-drop, which stands, I think, even less chance of coming off this list, and that's Skullclamp.
Really, I think it stands more of a chance. This almost falls into the realm of things where you have to spend mana to do the thing. I think that the fail case is when you right now, at least when you have Heritage Druid going, so you're not really spending mana to do the thing, but I would be interested in seeing what the non-Heritage Druid Skullclamp decks look like against the format. I think that it is less safe than Glimpse to unban, I believe, just because it doesn't really have the same fail state that Glimpse does, where it's just oh, well, I Glimpse and didn't have the resources to do all things. No, I just Skullclamp the thing and then I took all the game actions and it's fine. But I think that it almost falls into the Sword of the Meek realm where you are setting up to spend mana to spend more mana without really getting significant headway somewhere. There's probably something horrible that happens, but I'm willing to entertain the idea.
I kind of agree with you. I think that historical baggage just does make it a very unlikely card to come off, where for as much as Magic players like to joke about things, or not joke, they sincerely insist on it, but they say that this new development is going to kill Magic. Skullclamp may have done more than any other card, including some co-conspirators on this list, to actually kill Magic. You know, became very close to that in its heyday. And so I just think that they don't want to even entertain anything like that risk. That being said, if they went for it, there probably is some horrifically good Skullclamp deck out there, which doesn't exist yet, but it has a very good reason to exist once Skullclamp enters the equation. Maybe this just becomes part of like the Hammer deck, for example, or finding this off your Urza Saga once again, consistent access to that card. I don't know. I kind of don't want to think about it, but I also secretly do at the same time. Is that bad of me?
No, and I want to make a, as someone who was there for this era of Magic, I actually think that the banning of Skullclamp accelerated the issue more than Skullclamp's existence. One of the things Skullclamp did when it existed was it subsidized a lot of decks involving creatures. And you could play I think there was 3, maybe 4 decent Skullclamp decks that were distinct. And then once it got banned, it was all Affinity, and that was horrific.
Yeah, it was Affinity became Affinity, and then Elfen Nail became
that deck still existed.
Yeah.
There was a beacon. Listen, I'm going to get on my history lesson. There was a Beacon of Creation Blasting Station Fecundity elf deck using Wirewood Symbiote that was actually quite good for the brief period of time before the rotation. But I think that the worst days of Skullclamp were they were bad, but they weren't as bad. It's I'm trying to think of, it's how the companion days were bad, but there was a lot of different companion decks. It's a very similar kind of feel.
Maybe actually the home for this card would be a Dirty Kitty style combo Goblins deck, where this is just your Fecundity, except it costs 1 and is not a terrible do nothing card otherwise.
If that Goblins deck was good in Modern, I think that would be a good thing for the format.
Maybe. Sure. I'm willing to entertain that idea at least. So maybe more than I was coming into this. So maybe that's a victory for the discourse here.
Listen, I thought a different card would be my number one bad idea, but I guess that's going to be in a different episode. And, someone has to make a stupid statement about the ban list every time that someone talks about it. So I'm just going to make the stupid statement that I think Skullclamp is more in range than the majority of cards we talked about last time that were things that were legal and got banned.
Yeah, the whole next mailbag segment is just going to be, is Ari insane? What the hell is wrong with you? And maybe that's a good thing for content. Who knows? Anyway, we round out this segment at least with another equipment that earned a lot of ire in its day. And that is, of course, Umezawa's Jisei.
Yeah, I actually kind of hate this one more than Skullclamp. I think that the Skullclamp gameplay experience involves someone taking actions. It's very much how Storm is a better mechanic than Buyback because it's at least aspirational, whereas Buyback is just crushing someone's dreams. That's kind of what happens with GTA. And I think that the threat base of the format is such that there would be a lot of games where GTA just happened and you're just oh, well, that sucks. Well, we're done here.
Yeah, I almost think my issue with Jisei is that people wouldn't play enough of them, and that it wouldn't be my creature deck now pivots to Jisei as a sideboard 3 of against other creature decks. It's more of my deck that already had Stoneforge Mystic, well now that toolbox just gets diversified even further. And one of the issues with Stoneforge Mystic at present is it doesn't really beat the board in the sense that you can make the biggest thing on the board, or you can get protection from whatever specific 2 colors your opponent's deck is. But if they just have a creature that's a combo piece, right? They have a Devoted Druid or they have a God knows what, then it's actually kind of hard to interact with it. Whereas Mystic finding Jisei, just assuming you have other stuff going on, just kind of patches up all of those issues at very little cost.
Yeah, I think that this comes down to whether you view the one drop decks, the decks that are just fairly doing creature stuff in Modern as the good guys or the bad guys. And I've just come around to the idea that the Ragavan decks are solidly inconsistently the good guys, and all GTA is going to do is this is again the same thing as Mental Misstep, where you're polarizing the format away from cheap creatures into no creatures or I don't know, whatever the alternative is. And I just don't think that that's the most fun thing to have happen. I mean, I've gone on my rants about Plague Engineer, and this card is just Plague Engineer naming everything.
Yeah, just a nice thing to recur with Lurrus as well, as it turns out. And also a good way to shoot down your opponent's Lurrus. So can make those fun Lurrus mirror dynamics even more even more complicated. But yeah, I think that ultimately the effect of this card would be to... it wouldn't really touch most of the top tier decks, but what it would do is all of those like second tier creature decks or the tribal decks that currently are suffering under the yoke of stuff like Fury and Solitude. Well, now this is just another thing that they have to grit their teeth and deal with.
Yeah, this is also like a subtle lesson of the Modern Horizons 1 versus Modern Horizons 2 dynamic, where like the cards in Modern Horizons 2 that are interactive are just like stiflingly permanently interactive, and that was not fun. Whereas the cards in Modern Horizons 2 that are interactive are like brutal, but like very one shot, and you get to continue playing the game, and they're more fun. And this is just like a card that is in the vein of like Collector Oof, or like, you know, I mentioned Plague Engineer, and less in the vein of Fury, where like, oh, well, they would GT me once. It's like, no, it's happening forever. Yeah.
So all of that being said, I think this one is actually safe to come off. I just don't know if it leads to any good things in practice.
Yeah.
A card in that vein, which we didn't include on the list, and I don't know how intentional that was, or if it just happened to not fall into this specific category, would be Punishing Fire, which I think would be very safe to bring off. But again, it comes back to this issue of, are the cards that this is the best against the things that we need to target right now? Like, if your one-drop creature that already is dying enough to Unholy Heat, like, does it really need to die to Punishing Fire too? And then it comes back to this recurring issue of, all right, well, this isn't good against the Primeval Titans of the world or the Goblin Charbelchers, but it sure is good against just like anyone dumb enough to show up with, Lord of Atlantis.
Yeah, I think that Punishing Fire, which I didn't include because it wasn't on the original Modern ban list, but we can talk about it now. I think that it has a similar issue to GT, probably even worse because there's no inherent buyout fee of having your own creatures. The problem with Punishing Fire is like, it was the best in the Jund deck of that era of Modern where it ended up getting banned. But like, it's just miserable whenever you just like put it into I'm trying to think of the correct deck. Like the 4-color decks would probably just have it because of Grove. Like there's like this category of deck that just like doesn't care about its opponent's life total, that would then just like not have to ever care about creatures. And I just don't think that's what you want to subsidize in Modern. Like, again, this is the same thing that I talked about like mechanics that are like aspirational and build to and create something versus something that's just like, you don't get to play and I arbitrarily get to take like game actions that defeat you. And that's just not good Magic.
Yeah, so I think this raises a larger question of, there are cards which, in terms of raw effect on gameplay, how much they would warp the format, I don't know if just say all Punishing Fire would really change anything that much. That being said, do they lead to interesting gameplay when they do arise? Not really, although that is not like a definitive statement by itself, right? So how much of each of that should factor into these decisions? Is it just based on power level concerns? How much of it is play patterns instead? Like how much of each of that comes into it for you?
I think that once the card passes the bar of like, there's like a minimum playable and then like the next level above that of like, it would be an important feature of the format. That is when play pattern tends to dominate up until the point where like it would be the dominant thing in the format.
Mm-hmm. So but between this episode and the previous one, we have covered basically all of the Modern banners at this point. Should we get to some of the cards that fell through the cracks and just, for that kind of a completionist drive here?
I think we can stretch this out to one more episode worth of content. There's some big whammies in the like wasn't banned at first but got banned category that are worth discussing in their own literal segments.
Okay, we'll devote some more time to them in the future then. And this episode already getting pretty long, so I think it's fair to call that a topic for the day here, and we'll come back in just a second with Nonsense of the Week.
What's up, everybody? Cedric Phillips here, stopping by real quick to let you know about one of Star City Games' newest podcast, The Receivables, hosted by yours truly, alongside my partner in crime, of course, Patrick Sullivan, where the two of us discuss Magic sets, both past and present, from top to bottom. On every episode of The Receivables, you're going to hear us talk about the facts of a set, the mechanics of a set, the cycles of a set, the boring stuff, before we get into some crazy stories of when we were playing Magic during the times that the set was legal. We've got a ridiculous award show where we give out awards like the Char Rumbler Award for weirdest card in a set, the Oko Thief of Crowns Award for best card in the set, and a whole bunch more, before we finally decide, hey, what card won the set and what letter grade should we give the set? It's a whole lot of fun. We're having a blast recording them. Hopefully you have the opportunity to listen to it and you enjoy it as much as we're enjoying recording them. Where can you find it? StarCityGames.com or wherever else you listen to your podcast. The Receivables every single week here at SCG.
Okay, let's round this out here with a healthy dollop of nonsense of the week from the 5-0 League, Deathless Dumps, and elsewhere. And let's start with a friend of the show, Doomwake, who everyone loves Planeswalkers apparently. The Gatewatch really gets all of the kids out there going, or so I'm told. And Doomwake is really leaning into that theme here.
Yeah, this feels like a week where people just were like, I want to go back to like May of 2019 and play the theme decks of that era. And this was, Doomwake, Devin O'Donnell playing the Make Some Planeswalker deck, which is just 12 ramp spells and some Planeswalkers and some Oath of Nisas. This is an assortment of them. Dovin Hand of Control is one. It has a static ability. I don't really know what to say besides like these are some Planeswalkers and a Karn sideboard, but like these are some Planeswalkers and a Karn sideboard. There's also like some Karth the Lion variants popping up that involved red splashes for like some of the red Planeswalkers that were not in like the original sort of more Golgari Abzani builds, like Chandra. I think that those are like kind of interesting too, but here are some Planeswalkers. They are legal in Modern.
Yeah, Karth the Lion is exactly the kind of card that I want these Modern Horizons sets to be based around, where it's like a very unique incentive to put a 3-drop or 4-drop in your deck and like build your deck around. And instead, that just inevitably gets overshadowed by all of the 1-drops and 2-drops that the format is based around instead.
Yeah, Karth is like kind of in, I don't even know. It's in the ballpark of a 4-drop you would almost want to play, but it is the Planeswalker dilemma in Modern is kind of overridden by the 1-drops, as we kind of mentioned in the Jace discussion.
Well, hey, if you have a Dovin Hand of Control, I believe is the name, then some of those 1-drops turn into 2-drops.
Not Ragavan, though. That's the problem.
Yeah, I guess, Motide Region still costs the same. Although I guess we can... is it still a force field if you -1 on that thing?
Yes, technically, I guess. It's dubious.
It's technically correct, and that's the best kind of correct. So moving on to more nonsense here, we have nonsense enthusiast, connoisseur, aspiring spike at it once again with Jeskai Lotusfield. And this is an idea which he has come back to and iterated on frequently. So this isn't a new idea per se, but this latest update, I think, cuts a lot of the cute extraneous stuff and looks like a pretty functional and solid Modern deck that also has this really cool theme baked into it.
Yeah, I watched a bit of his streams with this deck, and it looked pretty impressive. I think some of that is that there's a lot less Alpine Moon right now than there has been in the past. I think that like the games where you get Alpine Moon after playing the Lotus Field are pretty bad. But the sort of like Lotus Field endgame where like you don't even really have to do a ton. Like if you just set up with Flagstones to ramp into like make some big spells and then eventually get to the Teferi Hero Dominaria untapping a part of the game. You do like a pretty bit, like one of the issues with the Azorius control decks that I've mentioned time and time again is that they're like really playing small ball when the lock pieces don't actually line up. And this deck like really overcomes the barrier between like small ball and like flashing back Cryptic Command or Memory Deluge and casting Cryptic Command. And like your Cryptic Commands can do stuff like pick up your Valakut Awakenings you've cast before. And like you do end up in like a real end game. Like you will see the one Nexus of Fate in Aspiring Spike sideboard, and like that actually happens to people.
Yeah, and there was a time where I thought that actual Lotus Field combo, so Twiddle Storm, I guess you would call it seemed like that deck should be perfectly positioned to capitalize on a lot of what was going on in Modern. But the fact that you do get incidentally hosed by all of the Alpine Moons and Blood Moons going around, I think that is a big part of why that strategy just hadn't succeeded, despite seeming like it should on the surface. Maybe the answer, as depressing as that may be, for what made this version of Jeskai Lotus Field Succeed, where the others failed, is it has a lot of broken MH2 cards. So we have Fury and Solitude in the main deck, and so this is a deck where you can cast both of those early 2-buy time, and then also once you have this amazing mana production engine set up with Lotus Field, well, this is a pair of solid 5-drops that you can just cast at retail price, and that's a good reward there. And then also in the sideboard, we have 4 copies of Ragavan, and so against similar decks to this, or combo decks, or really any deck where, of course, they're going to board out their own Solitudes and Prismatic Endings and stuff against your creatureless, or mostly creatureless, control deck, then Ragavan just gets to steal that lunch money.
Yeah, I think that, like, I like that the MH2 cards are in this deck because you're, like, actually trying to cast them for their real cost, when it's just, like, not like, oh, free Fury or Ephemerate Solitude. It's like, no, I'm tapping mana. So I think that's more of, like, a cute appeal of this deck than kind of a, homogenizing aspect of the format. But yeah.
Sadly, this also is a Kahira deck, because why not? And that's usually the thought process that gets you to Kahira is, well, we can, so may as well. And so in sideboard games, when your opponent doesn't reveal Kahira with this deck, the jig is up, because Kahira, sadly, for some reason, does not check for monkeys.
Well, you say that, but maybe they're just next leveling you because Kahira is so useless.
That would actually be pretty sick, because if you don't reveal Kahira for game 2, and don't board in Ragavan, and so they keep in all of their removal for game 3, and then I guess you just reveal Kahira and get to free roll them.
Yep, exactly. Big brain.
So, a lot to consider there, I guess. Moving on to another throwback of sorts, we have Banned Wilderness Reclamation here from Brussels Sprout. This is also a Kahira deck to pair with our Solitudes here, and Solitude is a card which is filling a similar niche in this deck, where, yeah, it can be the thing that lets you keep up with the more efficient decks in the format, but then also when you need something to spend this Reclamation mana on, Solitude is the baseline for that, below the Shark Typhoons and Memory Deluges and the one Nexus of Fate showing up here again.
Yeah, I like the other version, the Lotus Field version of this deck more than this, because you're not constrained by going through a 4-mana sorcery speed spell. But I understand that they're trying to do the same thing, and I don't know. I just like the aspect that Flagstones is a free version of Growth Spiral more in that deck. So unless you're very specifically think this archetype is good, but that there's too many Alpine and Blood Moons in the format, but not even specifically Blood Moon. I don't know. It's kind of a weird spot where I think the other deck is largely better unless you have a very specific reason you should be playing the Bant deck.
I do want to highlight the Isolates in the sideboard. So this is white for an instant that just exiles a 1-drop. And we saw this card pop up a little bit in the Heliod versus Paris era, where just tagging a Soulscar Mage, tagging a Swift Spear was the name of the game. And now we have Ragavan, DRC, and Death Shadow specifically all in one deck as high-impact targets for that card. And so in that matchup where they have so many good 1-drop threats, and also they have discard spells, Drown in the Lock, and so on, you don't want to be so reliant on just 4 Prismatic Endings, which also have some good other targets. This is just a nice, clean way to add some redundancy there, which maybe other decks want to take a look at as well.
Well, I mean, there's the Gut Shot in the main deck. Is that not just the same thing?
I guess so. And then Isolate, you can also board in against Hammer, where it's Sigarda's Colossus Hammer, and Esper Sentinel, Springleaf Drum. That actually seems like a fairly undervalued card at the moment. Yeah,
I think that the Hammer application is pretty important. Especially, there are a lot of decks that have this issue where they are bad against Esper Sentinel, but also need to handle all the other stuff out of the deck, and just having an effective 5 to 7 copies of Prismatic Ending for that goal would be really good.
And now, in closing, for the time being, I think after 37 episodes, the time has finally come for Savage Knuckleblade.
I was more looking at this sideboard, you see a guard approach, but continue on.
So this is Domain Zoo, I think is the broad umbrella term for this. And as we've seen, that can encompass a whole lot of nonsense, because you have 5 colors, and despite that, none of your cards are actually any good. And so you have to tie the room together somehow. And the way that FJ Rodman decided to do it was with Savage Knuckleblade, which I assumed when I saw this card scrolling through the creature base that, the trick here is this pitch is to, Fury and Force Negation and Force of Vigor and endurance all at the same time. Turns out, I think exactly one of those cards. Oh, I guess we have subtlety. Excuse me. 1.5 of those cards are in this deck, and it's actually just a creature that we want to play in our deck anyway, as it turns out. Or maybe not.
I think there's probably a mono blue card that pitches to Force Negation and Subtlety that might be better.
Yeah, actually, unless I'm missing something, all of them do. That's part of the trick.
Yeah. There's a lot of the 4 Wild Nacatl, 3 Ragavan part of this deck might be the funnier thing. Though this does remind me of a deck that a friend of mine played at one of the early Legacy GPs in Chicago that was Wild Nacatl. I believe it was specifically the Plateau plus Tropical Island theme deck. You know, you would turn 1 Tropical Island Wild Nacatl, pick it up to daze their spell, and then fetch a Plateau. Big thinking.
Oh, yeah. So I guess the thing that tickles me more is the 2 Savage Knuckleblade, 1 Tarmogoyf split, because we have the territorial Kavus. Those are locked in. And so, you know, that already pushes our mana base in a certain direction. But once we have to fill out the creature base, then, you know, I guess you keep them on their toes where, is there something which is good against Tarmogoyf but not Knuckleblade or vice versa? I guess everything is good against Knuckleblade. That's part of the problem.
Well, I think you need more blue cards. That's the problem. Also, your Knuckleblade gets abilities with Scion of Draco. I don't even know what the abilities are.
Oh my god, that's so... Let's see. It gets Hexproof, which I guess was already kind of built in with the whole return to your hand thing, but that's 3 more mana on top of just casting Knuckleblade, so nice to have that one on the house. Trample. Okay. First, second trample. Okay, so we get a 4/4, which still actually doesn't beat most of the stuff in Modern and Combat.
But what if it's a 6/6 after you activate it?
Yeah, but we can only do that once each turn is the thing. Like, what if they have a 7/7 Murktide Regent?
Yeah, I do enjoy how, like, the 5 color is very lightly applied in the sideboard here for, like, a Crime Punishment, a Lavinia, and 2 Rest in Peace. Just very, very light touches.
Yeah, the Crime Punishment is the entire, like, Abzan representation of the deck by itself, and then, you know, these are the 2 off colors, so to speak. I think the actual reason that we need Knuckleblade is to support the summon denials in the deck, which, given that this deck already has Force Negation, I don't know quite how necessary these are, but if you expect a lot of non-creature spells, then maybe that's the way to go.
But what if they kill your Knuckleblade on your turn? You can't Force Negation that. That's why you need the Stubborn Denial. Okay,
but they can't kill it because it has Hexproof for my Scion of Draco, which I guess already turns on Summon Denial. So yeah, I don't know. I'm out of ideas.
Yeah, this is where, you know, it was an interesting challenge to probably 5-0 the league with this. Because it's been a challenge to, like, try and piece together exactly where each of these cards applies.
So, just keeping this deck at the forefront of our minds, I think that's going to do it for this week. Lots to ponder before we come back in here next time. You can find me on Twitter at Domin Harvey. You can find Ari on Twitter at ARMLX. You can find us both writing weekly over at StarCityGames.com. And you can find us in here next time with more Nonsense of the Week. Take care, everyone.